what we're going to do now, the next part of this workshop, is we're going to take a few moments and we're going to really think carefully about the nuts and bolts of timeout. So we're going to drill down into what timeout is and what all the parts of it are, and think about what is the evidence for each of those parts, what's the best practice, and then we're going to talk about, okay, now how do we put those all together into an effective intervention? Okay, does that make sense? I put these references up here. You'll see some of them are probably older than some of the people in this room. These are really good papers if you wanted to read about timeout. They're papers that talk about these parameters, and they're short reads. They're only 3 or 4 or 5 pages, but you learn all you might want to think about in timeout just from reading these papers. They're terrific resources. First thing I'm going to talk about are commands or instructions. How many people in here have given a command or instruction to a child? Right. If you had to estimate how many commands or instructions might you give to a child in one of your programs in any given day? Many, right? If they put a tape recorder under my breakfast table, it would probably be in the hundreds. Because that's our whole morning. Do this, sit here, eat that, go there, get this, put this on, take that off, right? It's over and over and over and over again. And because one of the most frequent reasons for assigning timeout is for noncompliance, a child not listening or following directions, they're not minding you as an adult, you can actually prevent some timeout situations by just giving better instructions to the child. And up here are some examples. So good commands are ones where I actually look at the child, get eye contact. If it's one of the little peanuts I work with, I might actually, lift their chin up so they're looking at me, right, making eye contact with me, and then I'll say, go put on your boots. We're from Buffalo, right? So we put on boots a lot and take boots off a lot. You guys might say, go put on your sunglasses, right? A bad command would be one which I common do, right? From another room. Go put on your boots from the other room. I don't even know if the kid's listening, whether they heard what I was saying, right? Is it any wonder when I come in there and what I asked isn't done, right? So that's a bad instruction. I'm not going to go over every single one of these, but you can see manageable steps is important for a child with ADHD. So if I tell a child in a classroom, take out your book, your math book, take out a piece of paper, put the heading on it that I taught you, open to page 72, do the odd number items, and when you're done, return it to the bin in the back of the classroom. How many people think that child's going to do any of those things? Way too many steps, right? A good instruction is going to be, take out your math book. I like how you did that. I can see this table's ready. I can see you're ready for math. I like how my whole class is ready for math. Now, take out a piece of paper, right? And you go one step through another. You notice that there's praise in between each command, right? So I'm not just like a drill sergeant peppering the children with instructions. Every time they do what I asked, I thank them, or I say, that's great. I'm sending a message to the group that I value this behavior. When you listen to me, I'm going to pay attention to that. Because as an adult, I know I always pay attention to the misbehavior. The one kid that didn't listen, I got to say, hey, I just said take out your math book. Take it out, right? So if I'm going to praise the other kids, I'm going to make sure I'm distributing that attention equally. You make sure that commands are direct and specific. So you don't want to give the commands that I grew up with, right? Knock it off, pay attention, stop, quit, right? I heard one in the store the other day, zippity zip zip. Well, there's supposed to be a zipper, is it my mouth, right? Those are vague commands. You think about a 4-year-old or a 5-year-old or a 10-year-old. Can they tell what that parent has in their mind a zippity zip zip means, right? Or knock it off, right? That could mean 100 different things. You want to make sure that commands are positive. You want to tell commands that use positive phrases. You tell the child what to do instead of what not to do. Because if you start using what not to do commands, you're playing a game of whack-a-mole, right? Don't sit over there. Well, get away from there. Quit doing that, right? And the kid just keeps going around. You never told them what you want them to do, which was to open up their book and start doing their homework, right? That's a direct positive command. It gives them the instruction of what you want them to do. And I have just a couple of examples here I'll show you, and then these are some parents making mistakes with commands. And they're very short clips. They're only about a second each, or 5 seconds each. And then I'm going to ask you how you would do it better, okay?
Time for bed, Cameron. Are you going to pick up all those toys? Don't you think it's time to stop playing and get upstairs?
So what do you think went wrong there? Don't ask or beg? Don't you think it's time to clean up all those toys? No, maybe in about 10 minutes, right? Do you think this parent intends to offer an option here? No, otherwise they wouldn't be saying anything, right? They'd let the kid continue to play. So how would this parent mean what they mean? Pick up the toys, right? It could be that simple, right? Or you might make sure to get attention first. You might use a name to cue in. Jacob. It's pick up your toys and put them in the box or whatever it might be. Okay, you guys are sharp. Check this one out. See if you see any mistakes.
Joseph, it's time to clean up. We're going out. Joseph, it's time to clean up. We're going out. Joseph, it's time to clean up. We're going out. How many times do I have to say it? Clean up now. Joseph, clean up now. We have to go. Now.
What happened there?
Didn't get his attention.
No attention. Child's in a very engaging activity, right? These dinosaurs look pretty cool. They have teeth, right? It's very engaging for a child this child's age. What else happened that was wrong?
He's saying we gotta go, but he's like reading the newspaper.
Not a very good model, right? He wants something to happen, but he's not really doing anything to make it happen.
The child was so engaged, he could have given him a transition time, like we have 3 minutes to clean up before we're leaving.
He might have avoided a command altogether, right? He might have said in 3 minutes, we're going to leave. Let the child whose brain is working real hard on dinosaurs start to work on, okay, I got to stop playing with dinosaurs and do something else, right? That could be helpful.
Go along with the time. How about a timer? Say when the buzzer goes off and the bell goes off.
You could set a timer, right? Good suggestion. What do people think about how many instructions happen there?
Too much.
Has anybody ever had a supervisor or boss, you're trying to do something on a computer and they start saying, no, click there, no, write this, do that, right? It's overwhelming because you can't do all of those tasks that fast. And when people start peppering you with a request over and over and over again, we overload, right? Now imagine you have a 6-year-old brain. How fast do you think that one overloads? Certainly faster than an adult, and we have trouble with that. So good commands are going to be given once at a time, and you're going to wait and see whether or not the child complies. And then if you wait long enough and they still haven't complied, then you give one command again, or you might give it a consequence or something like that. But it's not effective to say, get started on your homework. Get started on your homework. Get started, and right, that's what we all do, right? We have a higher expectation for children than we have for other adults, right? When I go in and ask somebody in my office to do a favor, I say, when you get a chance, would you mind just doing something like that? Right? When my 5-year-old, get your shoes on. Why aren't your shoes on? Get your shoes on. Get your shoes on. Right? And that's a very high expectation. It's hard to do the behavior if you're still processing all this communication from the parents.
Okay, I think that's enough playing for today. You need to get upstairs and brush your teeth, put your pajamas on, get ready for bed. Make sure your lunch box is by the door so you don't forget it. Make sure your books are back in your book bag and you put your homework away in the folder that it belongs. And don't forget that you have art class tomorrow and you need a red pencil.
Did anybody notice anything wrong with that? Too much, right? Too many steps.
Cut that out! Hey, I told you to stop that. You're supposed to play quietly with those. You're not allowed to play with those the rest of the night. That's it.
What did you think went wrong there?
It looked like the starting put away quietly at the exact moment that he said, okay, that's it.
When we give a command, we're not off the hook as an adult. You got to watch and see if there's follow through. And if they do that, that's what you want to attend to, not the other stuff. Anything else people saw that was wrong? Cut that out. What do people think about that? Good instruction? I don't have a scissors, right?
He wasn't being specific in what the child was doing wrong or what was bothering him.
In fact, we don't even know. Was he annoyed that it was making so much noise? Was it that he was spilling all the blocks out all at once? Was it that he wasn't cleaning up on time? Right? It was vague. So a positive, specific instruction is better than a vague or negative one.
I'm all done with my writing assignment.
Great. Let's do your math homework now. Matthew, I told you to get started on your math work. Get going.
I thought you were going to help me.
So that's a little bit of a tricky one. What's the problem there? What is let's short for? Let us, right? And as adults, we say let's is a way to be polite, right? Because even though I really want you to do it, I'm going to pretend like I'm going to be doing it too so that it's not like I'm being a boss to you, right? But for children, many things we ask them to do are not joint activities that we plan to share. It's much clearer to the child, who may have trouble processing all this information really fast, if you just say, get started on your homework now. You're not confusing them with extra details that are unnecessary. So when we think about commands, if we could prevent one timeout per day in the families we work with, or in the after-school programs we work with, or in our schools, or in our summer programs, would that be a positive? That'd be a huge payoff, right? And then if we were not preventing just one for one child, but for all the children we work with, think about how much more time you'd have to do all the good stuff that we're in the business of doing. That's why we all got into this field, right? We like to do the fun stuff with the kids. That sort of approach, I can't I can't even do 2 steps at the same time. And I usually, thank you for bearing with me. So if you can teach parents or teachers, or as professionals yourselves, if you can give more good instructions, you may be preventing timeouts from happening due to a child not understanding or not knowing what to do or getting frustrated or getting upset or angry because they don't like the way the instructions are given, and that has a payoff for us all. So that's an important thing to think about. Before we even talk about how to issue or administer a timeout, we should think about what the triggers are for timeout potentially. And if we can deal with those triggers as adults in a more effective way, maybe we don't have to go down the road of timeout, which is always more unpleasant. Another parameter of timeout is a verbalized reason for why a timeout is given. So there's 2 ways to think about this. The one is just to say, you have a timeout, go to the timeout chair, or go to your room, or do whatever it is. Or you might say, you haven't been listening to me now 2 times. That breaks a rule. Now you have a timeout. Well, there's really no clear evidence in the field if one way is better than the other than there's some slight evidence that adults may be more consistent in timeouts if you make them list the reason. So what we don't want to have happen is that timeouts are given once a timeout program is rolled out, whenever a child or a parent or teacher gets a little annoyed with a kid, right? I don't like the way you're looking at me. You have a timeout. You didn't wipe off your feet when you came in the house. You have a timeout, right? That's not going to work. And so by making parents or teachers or staff list the reason, they may become more consistent with what they do with timeout. So if you have to say that's aggression, that results in a timeout, you're making the adult do a little check really quick. Is this one of the reasons for timeout that fits? And if it doesn't, then they shouldn't be assigning a timeout. On the other hand, we do not want adults saying, how many times do I need to tell you that hitting's the wrong thing to do? We just had this come up this morning. You hit your sister. Now you did it again. I don't know what to do with you. We're doing these timeouts. Now you got another one, right? That's way too much information. What you want to do in timeout is reduce as much adult attention as you can, so it really is timeout from attention. And then when time in happens, that's when you interact and engage and talk to the child. And that's hard to do as an adult, right? Because you want to talk to the kids. But again, if talking and reasoning with the child worked, and this is an 8-year-old child, we wouldn't be talking about them needing lots of timeouts, right? Somebody tried, I would bet you a lot of money that somebody at some point tried talking or lecturing or reasoning with this child, probably not just once, but many times in many different situations. And if that worked, it would have worked, and we wouldn't be dealing with current problems. Another thing is a warning. Mark Roberts has actually done some terrific studies on commands and warnings and things like that. Turns out if you can give a warning, like you guys see, we talk about speed limits again. Have you seen those signs that they put up that'll mark your speed and it'll flash red if you go over the speed? You see what happens when everybody goes by those? They tap their brakes, right, and slow down. That actually does suppress speeding behavior. You're giving drivers a warning, and then smart police departments a block up have a police officer with a radar gun, right? And if you didn't obey the warning, then you get a personal call from somebody about that, what you were doing. Warnings can serve as triggers to suppressing negative behaviors because the kids will learn, I don't like timeout. Thanks for letting me know I was out of line right now. I'm going to start doing something different. And it won't work every time, but if you do it enough, it may work over time. And again, now you're reducing the amount of times you have to deal with negative discipline situations with the kid, and that's a plus for everybody. The administration of timeout is important. Now this comes from the 1970s. You know, there was some thought, should you physically administer timeout, like walk and escort the child to a timeout area, or should you give them an instruction, like go to a timeout area? There's not a lot of research on this at all, so we don't really know what best practice is, but outside of evidence, probably the best advice you can give to parents or teachers is instructional intervention for starting timeouts, because sometimes by physically escorting kids, of course you increase their negative behavior. Nobody likes that. Adults don't like that. Kids don't like that. So that is a parameter people have talked about. There's not a whole lot of evidence on it, probably because most of the field had said, you know what, we're not going to talk about physically escorting kids at all. We're going to use our words to tell them where to go. Location is really important. So there are trade-offs in timeout, right? If you're in a group setting and a child's in timeout, sometimes they can be quite disruptive, right? Because they're upset. And so their behavior may get worse once a timeout's assigned. And that may take away from the larger group, which then becomes maybe other kids start to laugh at them, or maybe they start to misbehave. It can make it hard to run the overall group. And so some people think about isolation timeouts, where a child goes and sits in the principal's office, or they may go and sit with a supervisor or something like that. In homes, the child might be sent to their room or a hall or something like that, where there aren't other people generally around. Problem with isolation timeouts, there's a couple of them. One is that you can't monitor their child as well. So it's hard to see what they're doing and to monitor whether or not they're continuing to behave appropriately once the timeout's assigned. There's a trade-off, there's a negative for them too. If the child's not around the time-in environment, they can't see all the good things that they're missing out on, that they may be motivated to get out of the timeout to get back in. And again, think about a child's brain. They're not thinking about the greater scheme of things and the big context of their day. They're thinking, I'm really angry right now, and I don't like that I'm in here. And if they can't see that there's maybe a light at the end of the tunnel, they might have more negative behavior. So that's an advantage of observation timeout. I had a parent once that had kind of a middle-of-the-road location. She would time her child out for not getting along with the kids in the neighborhood. She really wanted him to have better relationships with the neighborhood kids so that they would keep calling for the kid and they'd include him in the games and that sort of thing. So she would be a good monitor. She wouldn't be out there right on top of the kids, but she would watch from her doorstep or she would watch from her yard. And if he got a timeout, she would put him inside the house so that all the other kids wouldn't hear his screaming and yelling and all that, but right inside the front window where he could look out and see the street hockey games or the football games and all those sorts of things. And he learned pretty quick, all right, I got to just take this time out so I can get back out there in those fun things. And so in that case, that mother, I think, was pretty smart, where she said, you know what, I want him to see what he's missing out on because that's going to be a motivator for him to want to get back out in the fun stuff. Duration's a big issue. This came up as one of the common problems when we were talking about that. If you read the research literature, there are timeout studies of 3 seconds, and there are timeout studies up to 3 hours, and a few more than that. So huge range in terms of time kids have been in timeout. But out of all the things that have been studied with respect to timeout, there's probably the best evidence for this. Durations don't need to be long to be effective. Most kids respond well to a short duration. 4 minutes, so there's a study, 4 minutes was greater than 1 minute, but you didn't have to go longer. 15 or 30, so 1 minute timeouts aren't enough, right? You can barely get into the spot to begin thinking about while you're there until you're out. But 3 or 4 or 5 minutes for most kids is enough I mean, think about hockey players. They only have to sit out 2 minutes, right? And they almost murder people, right? They slam them into the boards. Our 4-year-olds are being assigned to 20 or 30 minutes for just not listening. So if you really think about it, short periods of time are likely to be sufficient to suppress those behaviors in the future if the time and environment is well reinforcing for the child. There's also an interesting study that was done back in the 70s that showed if you use a 5-minute timeout, it's effective for kids. And then if you increase the time, say to 15 minutes, that's effective. But then if you try to use the 5-minute timeout again, guess what happens? It's no good. You spoiled it, because now the kid says, well, that's not as bad as the one you just had me in. I could get 3 of these before I have to sit out as long as that last one. So that's an important lesson for all of us as professionals, right? We have to be careful that we're not goofing around with all kinds of different times. Parents do this sometimes, right? I know I've been guilty of this myself with my own children. Sometimes we're in a rush to get out the door, and so it's a short timeout. Other times they're kind of distracting me anyway from something else, and I get into that and it turns out longer. If that happens lots of times over and over, we might reduce the overall effectiveness of our timeout, because we're spoiling the shorter durations by introducing more severe punishments. And then we have the shorter durations later. They don't seem so bad. They're not as much timeout. So it's an important thing to think about when we're setting up programs. Multiple people have talked about consistency. This is a place where consistency comes directly into play. All the staff have to be using the same amount of time. All the parents and all the adults in charge of the child's care need to be using the same amount of time. There's also release contingencies. So how many people have ever had a child in timeout that continued to misbehave? It's probably almost everybody, right? Some children will go and sit down and take a timeout. There are some children that get upset. They have trouble managing their emotions, or they may get angry, or those sorts of things, and so they might misbehave more once the timeout happens. In fact, they might do that for a long amount of time. So one question comes up is, do we really want to end a timeout for a child who's continuing to exhibit behavior that would get them into timeout, or that would be viewed as negative in the larger group? And so people do what's called a contingent release. What that means is that you have to behave and be quiet for some period of time, not a real long period of time. It could be 30 seconds, it might be a minute, it might be a couple minutes. But you have to show that you got yourself together and you're ready to rejoin the group in a way that's going to be productive for you and for the rest of the group. That's a contingent release. A non-contingent release would simply be, your time's up, you're out. You can come back and rejoin the group. Contingent release is commonly recommended. That's what most, as we talk about parent training programs, that's what most of them recommend, but not a whole lot of them are, this isn't a real well-studied parameter. There is at least one study and a couple others that would suggest that contingent release does suppress behavior better, because you get the child to control themselves, modulate their behavior, and then they can rejoin time in. That seems like a best practice. I also want to think about the reinforcing value of time in. We talked about this. I'm not going to belabor this point for you guys. There's also a thought, I put this in here because it's in one of the reviews that looked at the parameters of timeout. You can not only time out individuals, you can time out groups, right? So you can say, because of the group's behavior, everybody has a consequence, right? This happens in families all the time. It just happened in my family. Everybody was misbehaving, and we were supposed to go to candy bar bingo, and we said, if you guys argue one more time, you're not going to candy bar bingo. And they argued one more time, and the whole family missed out. And boy, we all enjoyed that. It was not a nice night in our house. But that was a group timeout, right? We didn't have one child go and one stay home. You can also have a contingency where, and the one place where this is important, the reason I put it in here, is that this can be a really good intervention if you think peer attention is driving the negative behavior. So what may happen in a classroom of kids is you got a clown, right? Somebody's really goofing around and, making fun of the teacher or doing some silly behaviors because everybody's laughing at him or her, right? So that's a peer attention driven behavior. If you say, you know what, from now on, if we have everybody following the rules in here, it's such a level, we all get some recess time at the, you'll have your recess time at the end of the day, or you're going to have to sit at your desks during recess time. You're going to be timed out from recess, essentially. Guess what happens to all the giggling and laughing and looks? It goes away, right? Because now these other children are invested in the good behavior of everybody else in their whole classroom. So that's one time when you might think about it. But there's risks to that. I don't know, has anybody ever seen the movie Full Metal Jacket? Yeah, there's a scene in there where the one soldier in training has a jelly donut in his locker, and you're not allowed to have jelly donuts in the Marines. Well, clearly, if you watch the movie, it's a big deal. And so all of the other soldiers have to do exercises and get timed out from fun stuff because that's not a good use of timeout. And I bring that up because I would never want to have anybody walk out of here thinking about timeout as a way to shame a kid or to jam them up. And I know you are all in this field because you wouldn't think about those sorts of things. But these sorts of things happen. People have ideas that they think are good that then they do. A group intervention is never going to be good if it's going to ostracize the child that's having the most negative behaviors, or they're not capable of doing the things that the group needs to do to earn the reward. As adults, if we ever use a system like this, we got to rig the game so that the kid is successful the first couple times and we're not hurting their peer relationships. Does that make sense to everybody? So I'm going to talk briefly about setting. How many people have talked with parents or have thought about timeout in the home setting? It's a jungle out there, right? When you think about somebody's home, it's not the case that somebody's just assigning a timeout and monitoring that timeout, right? Parents are doing the hundreds of other things that they have to do all throughout the day. There's siblings, there's maybe other kids in the home, there's pets, there's TV on, all those sorts of things. And so location is really important. And this is, again, well begun is half done. If you think about the location ahead of time and establish it ahead of time, you may head off some problems at the pass. So let's say we have a chair that's defined as the timeout area in the home, but through the door, the child can see the television set if it's on. That's going to be a problem, right? That's not really timeout from positive reinforcement. Let's say the parent decides that the timeout's going to be at the kitchen table, but the siblings do homework at the kitchen table, the parent is cooking dinner in there. How easy is it going to be to reduce attention to that child and make sure that they sit there during time? It's going to be hard, right? So thinking carefully about what would be a quiet location without a lot of reinforcing things around it, yet that the parent can observe and monitor is something you usually have to walk through with parents, because that's, most people don't think about it at that level. Let's say, somebody already said this, let's say we send the child to their room for timeout. Well, what's often in the room? Every cool thing in the home that the child likes, right? That's not timeout from positive reinforcement. It's unlikely to suppress those behaviors in the future. If you're in a family with siblings, well, we have to think about that. Do we have siblings in this family that when the child's in timeout are going to start making faces and teasing them or rolling balls towards them or doing all the sorts of things siblings do? Well, then we're going to have to think about that in the home setting, right? Are we going to have a rule for timeout for the siblings when somebody's in timeout? When any of you are in timeout, here's what has to happen. You have to ignore the other person. You can't be talking to them or interacting with them. We have to come to an understanding about that. School settings are important. So we have to think about, as an educator, do I want to assign the timeouts in my classroom and monitor it myself in the classroom? Or do I want to send the child to the office or to the school disciplinarian? Is there a policy in school for what you do about that? There may be, right? That's going to be important. We have to think about attention to escape or avoidance, right? Is a timeout always assigned every time I say open up your reading book, and all of a sudden that's when the child stops listening because reading's hard for them? They don't like to do that sort of thing. Peer attention is even more difficult to control in school settings, right? Because there's many more peers than there are in a home. It might be just a couple siblings. And we want to look at escape or avoidance. So I worked with a case one time where no one could seem to figure out what was going on. It was a young man, and he kept getting into timeouts. And we had the parent on board, and they were doing all kinds of great things at home. And we had the teacher on board. She was doing all kinds of great things in the classroom. And so I said, okay, well, we've set up all these behavioral programs. I don't know why they're not working. Maybe I'll come in and just stay for a whole day and watch from start to finish what happens. So I did that. In the morning went okay. And then the first class happened, and the child did something that got them in a timeout. And at this school, the timeout was that you had to go down in the hall to the principal's office, and you had to sit there, and then the principal released you back to the classroom. So I followed the child out of the room. We went to the office, and the child said hello to the secretary, and then there was a big M&M machine there, and he pushed the button, and an M&M came out, and he ate it, and then he went into the principal's office. And then he went back, and then a little while later, he got another timeout, And he walked down to the office, and he said hello to the secretary, and he got an M&M, and he went to his timeout, and went back. And they happened 3 or 4 times. Well, that's actually a pretty good behavioral modification program, right? If you want the kid to go to the office, give him an M&M every time he walks through the door. So that's something to think about in schools. Again, this gets back to the consistency. There's multiple adults. Clearly, the secretary in the office didn't understand that that was probably undermining everything everybody else in the school is doing. It certainly wasn't intentional, but it's the level that you might have to think about in terms of the locations in schools to really address those sorts of things and think about them and change them to make programs work really well. I don't know if anybody's ever had the pleasure of being in a supermarket with a tantruming child. It's an experience nobody would ever like, because you can just be minding your own business, your child tantrums, and what happens? You instantly feel about 20 eyes on you, and you can feel the judgment coming through the air, hitting you, right? That you must be the worst parent in the world. How can this child be tantruming in this public place? It is hard to manage behavior in public, right? Because we have some social conventions about not wanting other people looking at us, and what are we supposed to do? So planning ahead is a good thing. Well-intentioned strangers can be a problem in public places, right? Maybe it could be well-intentioned relatives. I don't know if anybody's ever tried to discipline their child in front of their brothers or sisters or grandparents, right? You're just finally are getting things in the right direction, and all of a sudden somebody comes in and does something, and now we're all the way back to square one. Oh, man, thanks for the help a lot, right? You might have poorly intentioned strangers. Somebody might come up and do something inappropriate, or start to give you advice on your parenting on the fly that was not solicited. That's why planning ahead is a really good strategy for timeout in other places. So if you know the supermarket's a difficult time for the child, that's when they may exhibit some behaviors that would result in timeout. A recommendation would be that before you even walk in that door, you get with that child and you say, okay, what are the rules for the supermarket? What's going to happen if you break a rule? Okay. If you do a good job in the supermarket, then you'll get something maybe pleasant when you get home, right? Special time with me or something like that. But you plan ahead, you outline what you're going to do, and then it makes it easier to follow through. It's much harder when you're in a crowded aisle with a full cart of groceries and a child falling on the floor, knocking stuff off the shelves, to think about all of those things, right? If you know, you can just do it. You might also have to think of backup consequences for public places. Sometimes it's just impossible to implement a timeout in certain situations, and so that might be a way you plan ahead, that you say you're going to be timed out from something pleasant later if we have any of these rules broken in this public place later. I brainstormed a couple of considerations to think about. There's certainly more than this, but when we think about timeout, we want to think about possible comorbidities or other things going on. So there's a couple of studies in the field that have looked at whether or not conduct problems are associated with better or worse response to timeout. We did a study that showed there was no difference for kids with ADHD plus conduct problems. However, a more fine-grained study found that kids that had conduct problems may have longer timeouts or misbehave more within them, and so there's some things to think about with respect to that. Kids who are kind of unemotional, who have kind of callous or unemotional traits, may also not respond as well to timeout. They may not make as much of an effect on them, so that's something to think about if your clinic happens to be working with a child like that. We want to think about anxiety with timeout, right? If we have a child who has separation anxiety, we wouldn't want an isolation timeout where the parent was shutting them out, right? You would want to make sure that you were sensitive to one problem while dealing with another problem. That's going to take a skilled clinician to think that through. Cognitive ability can be something that's really important, right? Timeout has time in it, right? And if you have a hard time judging time or understanding time, it may seem like an eternity to be in timeout for 3 minutes. And so additional tools like timers or shorter durations or things like that may be appropriate for some kids who have a hard time keeping track of things like duration or time in their head. Cognitive ability may also relate to how many instructions you can give about timeout or how many contingencies you can place within timeout, because it might be hard for the children to keep track of all of those things. You guys with me so far? So I'm going to just review. There's 3 studies that I could find that use timeout as a standalone intervention. We'll talk about those briefly. So how many of you work in the summer treatment program? 1, 2. Beth Nagy's one of the developers. Andrew Greiner is one of the developers. Dr. Pelham, who is here as one of the developers, we did a study within the context of the summer treatment program that looked at how well timeout worked on top of all the other good things that happened in the summer treatment program. So it's not accurate to say timeout was a standalone intervention. In fact, there was a point system. Kids were getting praised for good behavior liberally. They were getting good commands used by the staff. So all that stuff was humming along in the background and controlled for. So in all the timeout conditions, that summer program was happening. And what we did is we compared behavior for days when we had no timeouts assigned for negative behavior, but all the other interventions. Some days the kids had just a 5-minute timeout. So they would go to timeout for 5 minutes, and there was a contingent release. They had to behave for a minute to get released from timeout, and then they would be back with the group. On some days, they got a 15-minute timeout, and on some days, they got what we called an escalating, de-escalating timeout. And this is something Dr. Pelham developed, which is an interesting approach to timeout because it has a number of steps, some which may be very useful for particular kids. So I'm going to walk you through this timeout real quick, and then show you the results. You guys still hear me in the back okay? So let's say we're in this group, you're going to assign a 5-minute timeout. Okay? And tell a child you didn't listen twice, you now have a timeout. It's 5 minutes. If you behave appropriately and go right to timeout, you'll earn half the time off. So this is actually a really smart intervention because the one thing about timeout is that you run the risk of the child saying, well, I'm in for the goose, I'm going to be in for the gander, right? I might as well get my money's worth. You're already timing me out, so I'm going to say a couple things on my way out the door and you know, get something out of this. This timeout program does something that's really intelligent. It puts the child immediately back in an earning situation. So if I do the right thing, I'm going to have a gain to myself. There's going to be something in it for me to just serve the timeout and be done with it. If the child shapes up, says, okay, you know, our junior accountants are going to figure this out real quick. Oh, it's much smarter to just behave, and I'll get into timeout, get out of timeout quicker. Timeout's over after 2.5 minutes. You say your timeout's over, get back with the group. But if they misbehave, they're going to get extra time. So there's a cost to misbehaving, right? So if I want to say the last word, and we all know for some kids the last word is awful important, right? If they want to get that last word in, well, there's going to be a cost to that. We're going to double your time. But you can still earn half of that time off if you can calm yourself down and just go to the timeout area and serve the timeout. And we give them actually a couple times to shape up, right? To decide, to make a good choice. Okay, I got a timeout. I made a mistake. Made a couple of mistakes, but I can still earn some of this time off and get back. But eventually, if the child really can't calm themselves down at that particular moment, then we just cap it at 15 minutes. Okay, you have to serve the whole time, and we'll come back after you've been quiet for a minute. So that's what an escalating, de-escalating timeout is. It's more complicated than just saying you have 5 minutes to sit out, right? More steps, and it might be harder to teach a parent to do that or a staff member to do that. But for some kids, there may be some advantages to this approach. So that's why I wanted to look at it. Does everybody understand that? Any questions about this approach?
My guess would be that the younger the child, the less effective that would be. It says here 6 to 12, but I'm thinking an older child might be able to follow that reasoning better than a 6-year-old.
That's a really reasonable guess. There's only been one study of this. In our study, we didn't find any difference across ages. Doesn't mean there's not difference across ages for a particular kid you might be working with. And it certainly is simpler. And the other thing is this is harder to do, right? So consistency might be worse with a parent if they have to remember all these steps. You might think about that as a professional too. Maybe just a short timeout that's one time is easier to get done consistently rather than all these steps. And I'll show you the results, and there's a comment about that. So this is the first thing we looked at is we were just wondering from the point of view of the staff, did the timeouts reduce the total number of redirections, commands, instructions they had to give to kids during the day? And in fact, we found that. So this is kind of remarkable. This is commands per minute. So even though it's only 0.6 here, in 30 minutes, that means in the time when we didn't have timeout, staff were giving 15 commands they're giving about a half a command per minute. Every other minute, they had to tell the kids to do something. Okay, it's a lot of commands. We reduced it by half in really every condition where we had timeout. So staff probably were giving a command once, giving a command twice, and then having the child go to timeout, it reduced all the attention that they were having to give to kids for misbehavior or breaking rules. Does that make sense? Then we looked at the occurrence of timeout behaviors, and we had two settings. We had a recreational setting where the kids were playing sports, practicing sports, going to the swimming pool. This included all the transitions that they did from activity to activity. And then we had a classroom setting where the kids were to do seat work and work on reading with one another. They did some work on computers that were related to academic instruction. And what you can see here, I should mention the recreational setting includes timeouts for aggression that was on purpose, destruction of property that was on purpose, and being repeatedly non-compliant, being told to do one thing twice and not doing it either time, okay? In the classroom, this represents just total instances of non-compliance. So this is how many times the kids didn't listen in the classroom. We didn't have much aggression or destruction in the classroom because the kids were sitting at desks. There wasn't a lot of opportunities to be around other kids or interact with them. But you can see something right away. You can see in both settings, anytime we added in timeout, there was an improvement in behavior. Kids did fewer of the things that caused them to get into timeout when we had timeout in place. So it worked. And it's important to acknowledge it worked even though all that other good stuff was happening in the background. Timeout made an incremental dent in these really troublesome behaviors over and above a really good program. So the consistent implementation by staff members of timeout was a plus. There's another study that Danforth and his team did. This was all with parents of children with ADHD and comorbid oppositional or conduct problems. And they used a forward chaining approach. What they said is, you know what, timeout is complicated, and there's lots of steps, so the first thing we're going to do is teach parents how to give good commands and instructions. That's what we're going to do first, right? Then we're going to teach parents how to praise compliance when kids listen, because we think that's important. Then we're going to teach parents to give another command if the child is non-compliant to the first one. Then we're going to teach parents to give a timeout if the child's repeatedly non-compliant. They walk through all of those steps with parents, have them try them out and practice it. They used a timeout that was 1 minute per year of age, and they had to have about 1 or 2 minutes of being calm before they were released. And if you look at the results, this graph is set up a little bit funny, but what they did, this is kind of a neat outcome. They put audio tape recorders around the parents when they were at home and taped all of their interactions with the kids so they could hear all the things the parents were saying and all the discipline that they were using. And they brought those back to their research lab, and then they coded and wrote down all the things that happened. And so this is before for mothers, and this is after for mothers. So if you look at how many times they argue, it was significantly less after they started using these timeout programs. And that makes sense, right? If you're using a timeout after a couple times of not listening, you don't have to argue with the kid. You know what to do. You just put them into timeout. This is how many times they had to repeat instructions. See, that decreases from 25 times of doing that to 20. This is how much praise they were given. That went up. So by adding in timeout and dealing with misbehavior that way, there's more time to praise the kids for good behavior. That's a positive. Their tone, look at the negative tone, went way down. Parents were just using a system, right? Rather than having to get frustrated or upset. And child noncompliance overall actually went down. So that's a positive too. I should mention, I have an interest in working with dads. And this was one of the few studies in the whole research literature that works with both moms and dads in the parenting program. Dads didn't improve as much with using timeout as moms. That's a good area to think about for future study. How can we best approach fathers to get them to use timeout in the same effective way that mothers were able to use it in this program? Now I'll tell you about one last study, and then we'll start talking about how to make this work in the field. This was a series of case studies where kids with ADHD some days got medicine for ADHD, and some days got a placebo pill, a sugar pill. And that was different all throughout the days. Nobody ever knew what the kid was getting. And interesting, and then some days they had timeout, and some days they had just the teacher reprimanded the kid or yelled at him. And some days they didn't do anything at all. On days they used timeout, it didn't matter if the kid had a pill or not. Their behaviors went down to zero. They behaved when timeout was in action, which suggests for some kids a good behavioral intervention like timeout may help people avoid having to use medication or make medication unnecessary in some settings like the home or neighborhood settings or that sort of thing. And something that's notable about this study, I don't know if I would have designed it this way, but it's an interesting outcome. They had the kids doing seat work while this was going on. So it must have been something that was positive about just being part of the group in the classroom that the kids enjoyed, which speaks well to children, right? They like to be part of the group and part of the action, that they were willing to reduce their timeout behaviors to stay in the class and do seat work, even though many people would say it's not the most reinforcing for kids throughout a whole day. So this is an interesting finding as well. There's consistency across the few studies that have been done that timeout works for kids with ADHD. And there's lots of examples of using timeout as part of a larger treatment package. The MTA cooperative group that did the biggest trial for kids with ADHD had timeout interwoven into multiple settings throughout the day, a summer treatment program, the home, and in school settings. There's a number of studies that have been done in the summer treatment program that shows that the package of which timeout is included helps kids be more successful in academic and recreational and other settings. And there's other teams that have used the same kinds of procedures and replicated the findings. So across lots of studies, timeout is a best practice for kids with ADHD. Then I want to make sure to leave enough time to talk about your own experiences with timeout and to show you a little video. I am going to mention, though, that if you do any behavioral parent training program, does anybody use a manualized behavioral parent training program in their work? What kinds of programs do you use?
Barclays.
Barclays Defiant Children or Defiant Teens program? That's right. Incredible Years, that's another good program. Any other people? I listed a bunch of them up here. There's others. This isn't an exhaustive list. But we went through and looked at timeout in all of these packaged interventions. Incredible Years teaches positive behaviors first. It makes a good suggestion, I think. Just pick one or two behaviors to focus on with timeout, right? Rome wasn't built in a day. You can't fix everything, so maybe pick a few big ticket items to focus on. They give specific information about location. It should be a dull, boring room. Sounds like good advice, right? They suggest 1 minute for year of age up to 5 minutes. So they cap it at 5. That's consistent with all the evidence that suggests shorter durations are just as good as longer durations. They specifically say use a timer. That's smart for little kids, right? They can't, most 4-year-olds I know can't tell time. The timer helps them keep track of how much longer they have. They also suggest if kids are non-compliant with timeout, as we would expect preschool-age kids or young children to be at first, you have backup privileges that get removed. That encourages compliance with the timeout programming, which is easier to manage and monitor and follow through with. If you look at parent-child interaction therapy, does anybody use this in their practice? Yes, some? Very similar. They tell parents to use a warning. They use a timeout chair. They have a standard location for timeout. They say timeout should be about 3 minutes. Again, a short duration for timeout. They have a contingent release, but it's not an eternity, right? If you can hold it together for 5 seconds and you're a 2 or 3 or 4-year-old, that's pretty good. You're about ready to get back and I can be positive with you and my interaction again. They specifically tell parents to ignore complaints from the child, that's a good thing to do. Many parents of young children get sucked into the complaints, right? Then you start talking to them, now all of a sudden we're in the same as what we were when you first got into timeout. That's something that might be a given for many of us, but for parents that might be an important thing to convey to them. You look at helping the non-compliant child, they very similar. So you guys are getting the point, right? Most of the best practice is interwoven into all of these parenting programs. They actually get more specific with location here. They say a child's bedroom is bad. We already decided that, right? That's probably good advice. I like that they have not options or a bathroom or closet or dark room. You hope that's a given, but it might be. I don't think it's a bad idea to say that. That's not what we're talking about here, because you would hate as a professional to have somebody twist your words in a direction that wouldn't be therapeutic. They have a rule about not going to the seat. Somebody mentioned this as a problem, that the timeout just doesn't start until you go to your seat. So you owe me that 3-minute timeout, and you're not on the clock until you do what you're supposed to do. They recommend a short duration. They say use a timer. If you look at Patterson's program, he's the location of a very dull place, non-reinforcing. They say use a timer. They say 3 to 5 minutes. So one of the things that was interesting, COPE program, has parents come up with their own suggestions, but they guide parents in the same way as these other programs. The Defiant Children program says the same thing. Timeout chair or bedroom's the location, 1 to 2 behaviors, that should say 1 to 2 minutes for year of age. Use a timer. So there's a lot of commonalities. You want your timeouts to be of relatively short durations. I don't know what your experience is, but that's not always what parents or teachers or other folks are thinking about with timeout, right? They're thinking, this kid just did something wrong. I want to zap them. It should be a long duration. Well, in fact, the best practice is short, because our goal is always to get that child back into the positive therapeutic learning situation as fast as possible. And if a short timeout suppresses those negative behaviors just as well as a long one, that's a no-brainer, right? We should have them in for a short period of time. Almost all the programs suggest giving warnings before timeout. You want to avoid timeout, right? That's our goal as an adult, and not have to go to bat for timeout. So if you can give warnings, you might prevent it. That's a positive. All of the programs suggest contingent release is important. That's probably important for lots of reasons. You wouldn't want a child who is still having trouble controlling their emotions or their behavior going right back and doing the same thing that just got them in a timeout. That's demoralizing for a parent or a teacher, right? So if you can get them to exhibit appropriate behavior and calm down and then put them back in, it's more likely that the adult's going to think the timeout was successful. So here's, you guys ready for a transition now? Now we're going to talk about how to put it into action, how to make it work with where we are. How many people have heard from somebody timeout just doesn't work? I hear it every single time I ask, do you use timeout? Almost universally. A parent or teacher will say, oh, that doesn't work. Well, we talked about famous Ray's Pizza, right? Before we know what doesn't work, we have to know what the parent is calling timeout. And so the first step for any good clinician is to find out, have a parent describe what timeout is in their home. And what you'll find is it's literally like a box of chocolates. Parents will describe all sorts of different things when they talk about timeout. Sometimes they won't even talk about timeout at all. They'll talk about yelling at the child or privilege, some sort of privilege system or something like that, which may be related, but not exactly the same thing. The other thing that's helpful, I don't know if you find this in your professional practice, when I have people describe how they use timeout, I always follow it up with a second question. Say, okay, now think about the last time you gave a timeout. Can you tell me what happened then? How many times do you think I get the same story? Not often, right? So there's sometimes parts of a timeout plan that a parent intends to use that gets lost in translation when they're trying to apply it, and so it's often informative to ask that second question to find out. And if you want to dig deeper, you can say, okay, now think about another time. Tell me about that. And as a clinician, I'm interested in the story, but what I'm thinking about is, do they use contingent release? What's the location they're talking about? What are the behaviors that the child's getting timed out for? Are they describing any attention that the child's getting while they're in timeout? I'm thinking about all these parameters we just talked about, because that's what an intervention plan's ultimately going to target. I also think it's helpful, I mean, who's the biggest expert on the kid we're talking to, right? The parent. No one knows them better than the parent who brought them in. A teacher who's worked with the child for a number of months in the classroom, they're the biggest expert on how that child behaves in the classroom, right? A staff member who's been working with the child in an after-school program or a summer treatment program is the best expert on how the child's behaving in that setting. So I never discount when people say, well, this has worked before and this hasn't. Why reinvent the wheel if there's something that's working well? And I certainly wouldn't want to repeat mistakes or things that have already been found to not be effective. So these are, I just listed some questions that we have on our own evaluation form when parents come in to talk with us about timeout. But something that happens quite often in homes is there aren't house rules, right? There are house rules, but they're implied house rules, right? And they range from things. When we ask parents to tell us their house rules, they're all over the map. They say things like, you have to put your dishes in the sink, to you can't use drugs, right? And then everything in between. Well, not all of those things that parents are conceptualizing as house rules are going to be targets for timeout. So it's often helpful to have the parents think about, well, what are behaviors that you would have an immediate consequence for, typically, you do something about. Those are going to be the things that you're eventually going to apply timeout to. And most parents aren't going to have an immediate consequence like taking away a phone or a television time or something special for forgetting to put dishes in the sink, right? They might do it if they told them 6 or 7 or 8 times and the child refused and became defiant or did something like that. So you want to make sure that the things the parents are thinking about for timeout are good candidates for timeout. It's timeout from positive reinforcement, right? So you want to know, what does the child like to do? That's an important thing to investigate. It's also useful to know what does the child not like to do, right? As a clinician, now I'm thinking about those stories the parent told me, are timeouts happening during these times, during times that they're doing things that they don't like. That might be a useful thing to follow up on in a clinical intervention. We also want to know how the parent responds, and parents are typically pretty straightforward with you when they tell you, right? I'll yell, I get really angry, I get upset. Sometimes I just let them have their own way because it's not worth it. If any of those things are going on, it's useful to know about. And then you want to know specifically about the timeout, as we talked about before. So how many people in here have ever established a timeout plan with a parent or teacher or with staff? Most people? You probably walked through these steps, right? First, you define what the behaviors were that were going to result in timeout. In many programs, it's aggression, destruction, repeatedly being non-compliant. Sometimes it's swearing. Sometimes it's talking back or not being respectful to adults. It depends on your setting or where you are. But any of those things may be candidates for timeout. Something that is really useful but not often done is to think about what the rules for timeout are. They might be different rules than the rules you have for time in, right? What are some examples of things that you might have as a rule for timeout? What is that?
Sitting down and sitting still and being quiet.
You have to stay in the timeout area. You're not allowed to wander around or get places. And in timeout, you have to be quiet. You can't have more behaviors that are disruptive or negative or things like that, right? Those are two great rules for timeout. And they might not be expectations you have for your general classroom or your general home, but in timeout, those are things you have to do. Those are two great ones. Any other ideas? Might have a rule go right to the timeout area. Sometimes that's a rule, but you might think about it with your case. The location's important. We talked about that. Duration's important. We talked about that. But with any particular family or program or classroom, these might be slightly different based on the setting, right? All of those parenting programs I talked about, many of them talked about having backup consequences for not complying with the timeout program. And this may be very important for some kids. So as a parent or a teacher or someone else, you don't want to take away the most powerful consequences right away, because what do you have left as ammunition the next time the child misbehaves, right? It's much better to use timeout and the threat of losing those things in the background. Now you get to use them more often and for longer periods of time. But a backup consequence might be you can't use your bike for the rest of the day if you break 3 timeout rules today, or maybe you can't watch a television program, or maybe you have to stay inside, whatever it might be. Helping parents think about release contingencies is important too. Parents don't often think about this. All the actions up front, right? My child misbehaved, I sent him to timeout, I set the timer, and then, well, now what are you supposed to do when the timeout's up? Is it up when the child sneaks downstairs and, really quietly starts going on with their day and you say, okay, they're okay now? Or is it going to be a more formal discussion that you're going to have with the child? And that relates to how you end timeout. Consistencies come up 3 or 4 or 5 times today. That's probably one of the most critical considerations when we talk about timeout plans. Who's going to be in charge of it? Who's going to make sure that everybody else who might administer a timeout knows what they're doing? Do we have all the materials that we need for a timeout plan? I'll show you a video in a moment. We looked around. I'll plead guilty to this. We were supposed to, for our children's timeouts, we're supposed to have a timer. We couldn't find a timer anywhere in our house. So and that's probably not uncommon, right? That when you're looking for something, you can't find it. And you might want to buy a couple if you have a child that gets angry easily, right? Because one of them might get smashed. And so you need a backup for that just in case that happens. Do you have a location that's clear and straightforward and not around other reinforcing things? If not, you might have to do some home redecorating, right? You might have to move a chair over. You might have to change the layout of a room. And then something that can be really effective and helpful, there's no studies that show that this makes a difference, so this is really just a best practice recommendation, is to actually explain the procedures to the kids. To sit them down, explain what's going to happen, role play what they're supposed to do, actually walk them over and show them where they should go if the timeout's assigned, let them know what you're going to do, how it's going to work. That's antecedent control, right? You're priming them for if this happens, this is how it's going to work. You're hedging your bets a little bit and maximizing the chances that when you do have to assign a timeout, it's going to work better than if you just start spouting off and the kid gets mad and doesn't know what to do and doesn't know where to go. And Another best practice is to review these procedures frequently. So as adults, we could come up with a plan, we could talk about it once, we could review it once, and everybody in this room would probably be able to do it pretty well, right? That's because we're adults. Children will need multiple reminders, multiple practice, multiple role plays. If you're in a different setting, even though we might think, well, this happens everywhere, it's important to tell the child it still happens when you're playing with your cousins. Same rules apply. Here's where your timeout area is going to be. Here's what I'm going to say. Here's what you're going to do. That is the sort of thing that maybe parents sometimes take for granted, but could be a really effective way to make sure children are more compliant with the procedures. Now, I believe in being realistic whenever I do a behavioral plan. I will admit to this, I've never done a behavioral plan where people did 100% of the things that they were supposed to do, including myself, right? Life gets in the way. It's hard to always give a timeout. It's hard to keep the kid in the timeout for the time you said. All those sorts of things happen. But even though I'll acknowledge that inconsistency happens from time to time, I don't like to tolerate repeated mistakes. So if we find out that this is a place where we're having a hard time with consistency in this family or in this program or in this classroom, I'm going to want to sit down with all the interested parties and figure out how can we fix this? Do we need to change the program? Do we need to add more help? Do we need to change our focus? Whatever it might be. And we want to do those ahead of time and tell the child ahead of time that these are changes so that we're not reacting to negative behavior by loosening up our expectations, which sends a completely different message, right? Basically sends a message that if you misbehave enough, then we're not going to put these demands on you. If we sit down and say, well, here's how it's going to work from now on. We're going to do this from now on. Do you understand what I just say? Okay, now we're all on the same page. And then you can work the plan in a much more effective way that way. And then, you know, I put this in here because I know I was talking about lots of uses for timeout. I want to remind everybody that timeout's working if you don't have to give it very often. And you should really be your bright, enthusiastic, nurturing, warm, engaging, attentive selves with the children every other time, because that's going to make your timeout programs way more effective. Now, in addition to checking consistency, we also want to make sure what we're doing works, right? So I talked about baseline data before. Here's where we evaluate. So if a parent or teacher or staff collects information on how many times children are breaking rules or exhibiting timeout behaviors, we want to have that before we make a change to our plan so that when we mark plan changed, we can look and see, does their behavior improve or get better? If it doesn't, we haven't hit our mark, right? We need to change it again and try something else. And we also want to think about using multiple measures. So you might have no change in time spent in timeout. Maybe a child has a really hard time getting calm, controlling their emotions, so they're spending, say, 30 minutes in timeout at baseline, and they're spending 30 minutes in timeout per day during intervention. But if you also kept track of how many times they had aggression, and that goes down, that tells you something, right? It's that you're suppressing that behavior, but there's something about the timeout that's making the child have a hard time calming down and getting done with the timeout and getting back with the group. And that might be someone who I think about for the escalating, de-escalating timeout. I might say, okay, timeout works at suppressing this behavior, but it's still happening. Now I got to think about what happens when a timeout is assigned. Maybe what I have to do is put the child in an earning situation, and they'll reduce the amount of time that they're in timeout. That's a working guess that I could try out and see whether or not that might work. Other thing to always remember, behavior might get worse before it gets better, and really important to think about is behavior change is slow, right? Anybody that's ever tried to quit smoking or lose weight or learn to read or play a piano, none of those things happened overnight, right? I wish some of those things happened overnight. They don't. And just like it takes time to do all of those things, it takes time to change behavior on the part of kids. I won't spend a ton of time on revising timeout. That's a good thing to do. I'm going to show you a quick video. Okay, this is a little bit of a campy video. It's a home movie of my family because that's the kids that I could get to consent to be in the video for this workshop. I'm modeling a good parent, so I'm clearly acting. The children are well behaved. They're acting too. I'll show you, the goal of this is to show how you might present timeout to some children in a family. You'll notice that we didn't really control for any extraneous or extra things. My 1-year-old daughter is wandering through screaming. I thought maybe I'll leave that in because that's how most homes do work. It's hard to find a quiet time, if that even exists, before everybody's asleep in bed. And I show this to you. The production values aren't great, but what I'd encourage you to do is think about what parameters that we talked about are included in this discussion. And also, I didn't do everything right. Are there some things that you would maybe suggest to parents to do or that you would do in your own practice that's a little bit different? Well, guys, you know why we're sitting here today?
Because we were fighting with each other.
Yeah, we had another time of no fighting. I want to tell you something. Your mom and I are going to do something different around here. What have been the big problems lately that we've been having a lot of yelling and arguing about? And we've been taking away your toys and things like that. What do you see?
Not listening.
Yeah, people have not been listening, right? When we ask them to do things, we have to ask them a bunch of times.
Arguing and fighting with each other?
Fighting, yeah, that's been a problem. People aren't keeping their hands to themselves. So from now on, your mom and I talked about this. We're going to do something new, okay?
Yeah.
Every time somebody doesn't listen, twice. So we'll give you one warning, all right? But if you don't listen the second time, we're not going to keep telling you again and again like we've been telling you. From now on, you're going to get a timeout if you don't listen to the same thing twice in a row, okay? If anybody ever fights, doesn't keep their hands to themselves, so what does that include around here? Well, you're going to probably get a timeout.
Hitting, pushing.
Yeah. What else?
Punching, wrestling, tackling.
Yeah. The other day, somebody threw a block at the other one's head and conked him in the head, right? That would count for fighting?
And that happens in wrestling.
Yeah, anything that hurts somebody, okay, or could hurt them, okay? If any of those things happen, you know what I'm going to say?
What?
I'm going to say, that's not listening twice, or I'm going to say, you're fighting. That breaks a rule in our house, and you now have a timeout, okay? Okay, well, we'll take care of that in a minute. What I want to tell you right now, Juliet, this is important. When I say you have a timeout, do you know where you're supposed to go? Right to this chair, okay? This is going to be your timeout. You're sitting in this chair on your bottom, okay? Tom, you're going to have your own timeout area, and it's right in this room over here. You're going to be at our dining room table at the chair near the back window, okay? You can peek around and take a look if you need to take a look.
This one?
No, the other one on the far end, okay?
Okay.
All right? You guys with me so far?
Yeah.
All right, let's practice. Stand up. All right,
Mama, there's a piece of rice down there.
come on, over here. Now let's practice. When I say you have a timeout, you have to go to your area, okay?
Yeah.
Julia, you have a timeout. Go to your timeout area. Tom, you have a timeout. Go to your timeout area. Okay, come on back. You're not really in time. I know you guys are never going to have to do this, but we're just practice just in case. Take a seat again, and then I have one more thing to tell you, and then then we'll be done. We can go in and watch our TV show before bed. Okay? Here's the last thing I'm going to tell you. If somebody, you know what? When you guys usually get in timeout, are you happy or sad?
Sad.
Sad. What else are you sometimes?
Mad.
Mad. Yeah. Sometimes people get really mad at timeout, and sometimes when people are mad, they do more things that get them into trouble. So from now on, we're going to have a rule about timeout. And that means once you get in a timeout, you can't have another behavior that's a bad behavior. Okay? So that, what does that include?
Screaming.
Screaming. What else?
Hitting.
Hitting.
Disobeying.
Disobeying some more, right?
Pushing.
Pushing. Whining.
Not listening.
Not listening. All those things. If that happens, you know what's going to
Hand
happen?
contact.
Yeah, anything like that. Yes, you guys got them all down. If any of those things happen, you know what you're going to do?
What?
You're going to get extra time put on top of your timeout. Okay? So it's going to double. So if you have 5 minutes,
10.
it's going to go to 10. That's very good. Okay?
Yeah.
But now listen to this. If you behave when you get a timeout and go right to your timeout chair, guess what?
What?
You get half the time off.
Oh, yeah.
So if you have a 5-minute timeout, how many minutes will it be?
2.5.
2.5. Way short. Okay? And I know when you get a timeout, you're always asking me if you can get out. When's it over? When's it done? You'll be all done. Okay? So that's what we're doing from now on. Do we have an agreement? Okay? Do we have an agreement?
Yeah.
Shake with the other hand. Okay, very good. Thank you. Just pushing the button. be back in a couple of years for that one, right? So now we're going to see it in action.
Julia, come on!
Tom, that's not acceptable. That's fighting. You now have a timeout. It's going to be 5 minutes. Go sit in your timeout chair. That was really good that you didn't hit him back, so I'm proud of you. The timer is set for 5 minutes. And there is a union mandated break for the child actors, so the 5 minutes are continuing. Tom, you're out of your area over there. That was one of our rules of timeout. You now have a 10-minute timeout. If you shape up and just start behaving, it'll go back to 5 minutes. I'm going to set the timer right now. And then the 5 minutes are up. Okay, Tom, your time's up. How come you were in timeout?
Because I was arguing with Julia.
Yeah, and then what'd you do?
I kicked her.
Yeah, and it's not funny. That's one of our rules of the house is not to do that. I'd like you to go in and apologize to her for that.
Sorry, Julia.
That's okay.
Nice job, Tom, for apologizing.
Was that purpose? Was that just for a game?
So it's just that easy, right? Yeah. Easy to do. That gives an idea of the flow and how things will work. That's actually quite a bit for a parent to manage, right? You got to find the quiet time. You got to sit down. You got to talk. You have to think ahead what you're going to talk about. Then you got to talk about it. Then you got to make sure kids understand. Then I can't believe he just kicked her. We just talked about this, right? I got to keep calm. I got to remember what I said I was going to do. I got to do it. Then I got to monitor that whole thing, right? How many people have ever seen a kid do that, sneak out of the timeout area, right? Or do you really mean it or not? But I got to be aware of that, catch it as fast as I can, put it back, end the timeout nice, have them come back. That's a lot of work, right? So when we say you just need to use timeout, right? I talked about the pediatric recommendations. Those probably aren't in-depth discussions about how timeout's going to work, right? It's part of the child visit, so they're doing tons of things. They're saying, well, you should use timeout. Many parents might not understand exactly what you mean to convey with that. So I think that's a point of this whole workshop, is that this is actually a larger intervention than the way we typically conceptualize it in our practice with parents or teachers or other adults.
It takes time and effort, and I think most parents, they want the easy way out.
Sure. Who wouldn't like the easy? I would like the easy way out. And so that's really our job as clinicians, is to figure out how to do this in a way that's going to make the parents see some value in this. How can we set things up for success? And we have to keep remembering change is slow, and we have to keep saying change is slow, because we have to have the parents understand the expectation that it takes some time for all these things to work together and to make a difference. And it doesn't happen overnight. If it did, none of us would have jobs, right? We wouldn't be in business. Take a look at this case, again, in your groups or with your partners. I'd like you to take maybe 2 or 3 minutes and think about what you might do in terms of a starting point of dealing with this family, okay? There's a 6-year-old boy. The family's already using timeout for non-compliant behavior that's repeated. They assign a 6-minute timeout because he's 6 years old, but he's always out of his area, and he gets mad and yells at his parents when he's in timeout. When's it over? This is the worst. He might even say hurtful things like, you're the worst parent in the world, right? When children are angry, they say things they don't mean. Some parents really take that to heart. Kids don't mean that, of course, right? And now parents are starting to think, you know what, this behavior is so unpleasant when we give a timeout, maybe timeout doesn't work. Take about 2 or 3 minutes and think about what advice you might give to these folks if you were the person consulting or working with them, okay? Maybe we can just go around and have some people talk about some of the ideas they brainstormed. There's really not a right answer to this, right? Because you don't have a whole lot of information. But as a clinician who's kind of wondering where I should go with this, you want to start generating these questions to yourself. Did you have one up here?
Yeah, my advice, I think, to the parents would go back and ask them if they have if they are implementing the collection of behavioral strategies working in concert, which means the planning ahead, effective instructions and commands, the planned, ignoring, rule setting and management, the differential attention to alternative behavior, and the contingency management. Given that I'm a counselor working with them, and I have told them these are the guidelines that they could follow to get results. That's one situation that I would suggest to them.
So you might say, okay, let's take a step back.
Right.
Timeout's one part of the things you do, one part of your toolbox that you're using as a parent. Let's take a step back though and think of what other tools are you using to help your child be successful. And here are some things. And maybe we should try more catching him being good, right? Maybe he really wants your attention, and what he's finding when he's in timeout that he's drawn to not liking that attention being taken away. Well, if that's the case, we want to really go overboard on time and attention so that he wants to stay out of timeout because he really likes it. So you might have a working guess that maybe some of these other foundational skills need to get boosted up in order for this timeout to even be considered for working. Good guess. What else do people say?
Maybe minimize the time from 6 minutes, maybe make it shorter.
So maybe reduce the time. So maybe this is a young man where 6 minutes feels like 6 years. And what he needs to do is, maybe what the parents need to do is say, okay, you know what, if we can get you into timeout for 2 minutes, that's just as bad for you as 6 minutes or 60 minutes, but you can hold it together better for 2 minutes, then we can get you into time in faster and we don't have all the other trouble that's going on. Great idea, right? That's a working guess. You could try that out.
Why are all the parents taking a timeout?
Maybe the parents need to take a timeout.
So even though that you explain to them again and again, they are so tired. So maybe they need, to take their own time out and, recharge.
How many people are parents in here? It is exhausting to be a parent, right? I can't believe you have your eyes open right now. It is exhausting. And so to be really good at running a program like this as a parent, you might have to have a situation where you don't time the kid out to a chair room. You say, I'm leaving this room and you can't come in here until I come back, right? You can turn it around and reverse that. Or just take 10 seconds to cool yourself down so you can be a more effective parent when you have to parent. That's a good suggestion. Some parents can do that really well. Some parents have a hard time doing that in the moment, and you have to find out if that's the parent that you're working with. Other suggestions?
Sometimes you might have to restrain them, meaning if you have these kids, if you have them not staying in timeout, you might have to hold them there. Not giving them eye contact, not giving them not talking to them, but having them stay there.
Some children in residential treatment programs or hospital settings or other places, if there's consent signed and all the waivers are out, restraint sometimes is part of an intervention plan to help the child self-calm and cool themselves off as they can. It's a possibility. I don't know that I'd recommend that as a frontline change to most parents. I think about that more as a last resort and a long last resort because you always run the risk when you put hands on a kid that their behavior gets worse because they don't like that. And so that does happen in some settings with associated risks that you have to decide if those risks are worth any potential trade-offs or benefits with all the stakeholders involved in that intervention. Anything else?
I've told them, I've used it. Timeout will not start until you're actually sitting down and you're quiet. That's it.
So this is your time, not my time, right? You're using up your time, and your timeout's not going to start until you're there and you're quiet and you're doing what the plan is that we all agreed on when everybody was calm. And if the child's with it, they're going to find out pretty soon that they're using too much of their free time wasted pre-timeout. And if they just get the time over with, they'll be better. Anything else? I'm gonna walk through a couple slides related to troubleshooting, and then I want to make sure to leave enough time at the end if anybody has any questions or comments or things that they're thinking about in their professional practice to talk about. these are the sorts of things that you all listed at the very beginning, right? One thing is that the timeout's not working. It's not reducing negative behaviors. Well, if that's true, I want to find out if I'm the clinician if that's true. So one thing I might think about is what's the function of the behavior? That little boy that didn't want to go in the swimming pool is going to keep being aggressive every time we go to the swimming pool because the function of the aggressive behavior is to avoid the swimming pool. It has nothing to do with the timeout program we had in place at all. It's completely irrelevant. That's important to think about. Other thing I always encourage parents and teachers to do is to collect data on how often these behaviors are occurring. I can't tell you how many times people say nothing's working, it's not getting better, and yet we look at the graph and we see a clear downward trend in the frequency of the negative behaviors. We would never know that based on the reports of the people we're working with if we didn't have the objective data to go back to and take a look at. So we always want to be a little bit suspicious when somebody says nothing's working because it might not be working because the behavior is not perfect, but it may be working in moving the child down to the level we'd like them to get to eventually. Sometimes kids don't understand why they're getting into timeout. If we don't have well-defined behaviors, or if the reason for timeout is that I, as the parent, I'm just so fed up with you at this point, I want you out of here, that's not going to reduce negative behaviors, right? Because it's very inconsistent. You want to make sure the kid understands the plan. Some kids don't understand what timeout is. As adults, we understand it's pretty simple. I tell you to go sit in that chair, and then you go sit in that chair. But it's new to the kids, right? They've never had this happen before. They might need somebody to walk them through and explain it. Sometimes kids don't refuse to go to timeout. This gentleman here just said, don't start the timeout until the kid's in the area. That's one way to try to solve that problem. Sometimes the kid doesn't understand where they're supposed to go. The area is not well defined. You can use backup consequences for noncompliance with timeout. You can also use location-free timeouts. So if your attention, there's actually some old case studies that showed the teachers just stopped paying attention to the child when they were aggressive for a minute or two, and then started paying attention again after a minute or two. And they would say, you were just aggressive, you're in timeout, but they didn't tell them to go anywhere. They just stopped attending to the child. That child's aggression went down almost immediately. They figured it out. They liked the teacher's attention, and most times they were whacking the other kid because they wanted the teacher to come over and talk to them. So by turning that on its ear, and only attending to the kid when they were exhibiting socially appropriate behaviors, the kid figured out real fast and stopped being aggressive. Sometimes kids misbehave in timeout. It's important to think about secondary gains, for example. So is the child in timeout getting attention from siblings or peers or adults? There's nothing more valuable to a child in the world than an adult's one-on-one undivided attention, right? If you don't believe me, all you have to do around a child is get on a telephone, and what happens? I need a drink, I need help, I need this, I need this, I need this, right? They're jealous of that person on the other end of the line getting your attention. And then you hang up the phone, and then now they want to tease their sister or brother, right? Because that's whose attention they're not getting. But that is very common that when adults are angry, which is typical when they're assigning timeouts, they give an awful lot of attention to the kids, and it might be a kid they didn't acknowledge all day otherwise. And so what is that child going to learn over time? The way to get this attention that I really desire is to be non-compliant or misbehave. And I don't care if I get this attention by hook or by crook. I just want it. And so as adults, we have to try to figure that out and think about that. Sometimes kids have a hard time sitting still, especially when we talk about ADHD, right? They might have a hard time sitting in a chair for 5 minutes. So they might do some kind of self-stimulation behavior like standing up or fidgeting or squirming or kneeling or doing that sort of thing. You might decide as a professional that as long as they're in that area, I don't care if they're sitting or standing or doing and not disrupting anybody, I'm going to live with that. Sometimes kids don't accept the ending of timeout. A best practice recommendation is that if a child's in timeout for repeated noncompliance, you would reissue the original command that got them into timeout in the first place, because you wouldn't want them to be able to escape or avoid a task they didn't like by serving the 5 minutes of timeout, but then getting off the hook for the thing they didn't like. So sometimes kids will refuse to do whatever it was. If you said to tie your shoe or to put your toys away or do whatever it was, one solution to that is that now that's another example of repeatedly not listening, you got another timeout. And that chain might go over and over and over and over again until the child does what they're supposed to do. And at the beginning, that chain might go on lots of times. But if you really stick to your guns and you're consistent, you'd expect over time the child would just do what they were told much quicker. Sometimes kids need a further cool down period. Maybe they're sitting quietly, but you come over and they zap you with a smart aleck comment or something rude or disrespectful. Probably you'd say that, okay, you're not ready yet. I thought you were. You got to sit here quietly for a minute before you can end your timeout. kind of went over this. The only thing I'd say is if you're having lots of complaints of the kids not complying with timeout, it is important to go back to the adults and think about, are they giving good instructions or commands? So is this child being repeatedly non-compliant because the parent or the teacher saying, line up at the door. Come on, line up at the door. That's repeated non-compliance. You now have a time. The kid didn't even have a chance to do it once, right? So you want to make sure that the adults are doing things the way they're supposed to be doing to set the kid up for success rather than for failure. Has anybody ever had kids say they really like timeout? I've heard that an awful lot. Do you think they're telling the truth? No. Typically not, although some parents take that at face value and say, he says that he likes going to timeout. Well, I would be an observer of behavior rather than what kids say. And that goes for anything, right? Anybody who's a teacher probably dreads when the kids go on the bus and go home from school because who knows what those kids are going to say happened at school, right? Kids aren't necessarily good reporters of what happened or their own behavior. I think I'll end there and see if people have questions.
Yes, I wanted to know, there were two things you talked about. I'm just asking a question. Is there a standardized tool for evaluating kids with, during timeout? Is there some type of tool that we can use as providers? And the second question is, the functional assessment, is there a tool? Because when we're providers under the Children's Trust, and when we have kids who are documented as ADHD, during the initial intake process, that would be a good time to do a functional assessment. So I was wondering, is there some type of a assessment or tool or some way you could recommend for us to access that document? And the last question is, how can we email you, contact you to get further answers or details?
All great questions. If I forget one, remind me, okay? So the first question is there a standard tool to document what's happening in timeout for the child, right? I don't know that I can say that there's a standard tool, but as professionals, we could make one, right? So one of the things that's really important is this consistency. What you're really talking about is we have to make sure that the integrity of our timeout program is good, it's solid. So we made this plan, everybody's supposed to do it. I don't think any of us would want to just trust that we'd roll it out and it would work, right? We want to go in and make sure, are the staff members being consistent? Are they giving good instructions? Are they ending timeout on time? Are they giving the right amount of time? Well, if you write up a plan, you could actually turn that into a checklist. And a supervisor, somebody could walk around and watch a timeout when it was administered and make sure you checked off all the boxes and that you didn't write in any extra things that people did that maybe weren't part of the plan, because that would be for the adults, to make sure the adults are doing things the way that they're supposed to be doing. For the kid, I don't know that there's a standard checklist for that either, but if your target behaviors are well defined, like aggression or noncompliance or something like that, you could count how many times they do each of the target behaviors. And that count is probably the best tool we have about how often you don't need a checklist that you have to score or do. The second question, I think, was about functional assessments. Some of the questions that I have up here are on the website for the CCF right here at FIU. People all around the country are accessing this website for tools and measures and information on good behavioral interventions, including timeout. So,
and if you want more specific training on things, one thing you can do is write down suggestions on these assignment packets that you're going to hand to me, saying that you'd be interested in these topics. And we also do come out to your agencies and do in-services. So if you want an in-service, you can just write in-service. If there are other topics that you'd like to see in the speaker series that are related to child and adolescent mental health, you can put that down as well.
And that's right on the web. You can print them out. You could use it. They're all free. I mean, one thing that Dr. Palm does that's very nice is he never sells these to companies where he charges it. You can download them, use them tomorrow if you wanted to. And then I forgot your third question. I knew 3 was too much. Oh, it's just my last name, Fabiano, Fabiano. Nice Italian boy. A-N-O at buffalo.edu. I'd be happy to follow up with anybody that wanted to. Great questions.
You could also help out with that
here.
Yes,
Yeah,
well,
too.
that would be even better since they're right in town. And the snow knocks down the wires sometimes.
That's one of the services that we provide, in services and going out to eat.
And I don't know if you know this, but the team here at FIU is recognized not only across America but across the world is the best team in the world for getting behavioral interventions for kids with disruptive behavior disorders. When I talk to colleagues at all different places, they talk about the team at FIU and the FIU website, and people are using these materials in agencies and in programs everywhere across the country. So it really is a real plus that you have this team here in Miami. There are a bunch of people in Buffalo that are very sorry that they moved not long ago. Any other questions?
Maybe I misunderstood. I'm not hearing any fast or hard rules, only guidelines. Like when you use the timeout, it doesn't go strictly by age. I mean, it's like 6 minutes. Sometimes you can lower it.
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. So the comment is you're not hearing any fast and hard rules, mostly guidelines. In most behavioral programs, I mean, you could set fast and hard rules, right? You could have a summer program or an after-school program or a school, and you could make a timeout approach. You could decide. And for many kids, it's going to work. That will be a sufficient intervention. In my experience, I think in most people's experience that do this kind of work, you're always going to have a few kids that don't respond to what everybody else, what is working for everybody else. And so that's why there's some vagueness in all of these things, because you can't necessarily say for any particular kid what the best intervention is going to be. In the timeout study we did, we had no timeout, we had an escalating, de-escalating timeout, 5 minutes and 15 minutes. I showed you that graph where it worked for everybody no matter what. But if you looked at any particular individual kid, there were some approaches that were better than others. So some kids did awful with the escalating, de-escalating timeout. They got mad every time the adult said, that's more time, and they said, I don't want more time, and now you got more time, and they said something else. And there were other kids that said, oh, okay, I'm gonna calm down because I want to get back with the group. So that's a challenge in our field, right? There isn't a one-size-fits-all intervention that's going to work for everybody. There's some guidelines and best practice. And if you have a large agency or a large group, it probably is smart to set fast and hard rules, but you want an opt-out where you can say, if somebody's not responding to this, here's our procedures for how to tailor them or change them to work for this individual kid. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. Okay, well, we better, I know it's lunchtime. Why don't we end there? Thank you for all the great comments and contributions. This is a real nice group to work with. Thank you.